Hey there. Sorry. Uh, I want to try to. I have been waiting on the Lord, and I feel like going into First Timothy. Believe it or not, I really hadn't been thinking about it, but uh, it just may be time. I've never gone through that book here, other than overview kind of thing. First and Second Timothy really should be considered a pair, and the way I look at these books is that they are a window into a church that's completely in apostasy, and yet God keeps investing. And that's Ephesus. Or at least it's the beginnings of apostasy, but it must be pretty bad, because Paul is telling Timothy. Timothy's so discouraged in 2 Timothy. His ministry is rejected. His association with Paul is being stigmatized. Paul's in prison as an evildoer. We know, he apparently had an ulcer. He was getting so discouraged that he was just not really functioning anymore. And he has to be encouraged to stir up the gift. Don't let anyone despise his youth. And he's even told to put on the armor and consider himself a soldier going to war. In the church, not out in the world. That's how bad things are in the church. And people will not tolerate the sound doctrine. They are really being overrun by the Judaizers. And Paul encourages him, in a way, by telling him, well, all the churches in Asia have departed from me, but I've run my race and kept the faith. People are departing from the truth, left and right. And the root of it is, when we say departing from the truth, it does not mean they're not saved. What it means is that they have been captivated by other things than the doctrine of Christ. And it's mostly through sensationalism that they're being carried off as spoil. And they are departing from the faith, but the faith is not, they're not departing from believing in Jesus. They're departing from the faith in the sense that Jude speaks of it, that we're to contend for the faith earnestly that was once and for all delivered to the saints. The faith, in that sense, is an objective thing, and it's the message. John calls it the doctrine of Christ. Paul calls it the gospel. And there's warnings all through the Scripture not to be moved away from the gospel. And that doesn't mean to stop believing the gospel. It means that is no longer the center. You are captivated by something else. And that other thing that you're captivated with brings you into bondage by moving you further and further away from the gospel, so that you no longer see it as relevant to the Christian life. And today we live in a time when the whole church is completely apostatized from the gospel, in the sense that they look at it as that's the beginning of the Christian life. It has no relevance to the way the Christian life is lived. Having begun in the Spirit, they're now seeking to be perfected in the flesh. But they're captivated by everything other than Christ. They have very little concern for Christ himself. Does it mean they're not saved? No. But they're vessels of dishonor. That Paul tells Timothy, you got to separate yourself from them. In every great house, there's vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor. And he defines the house and what it means to be an honorable vessel. Useful, We have a lot of people talking about profitable works, and they are unprofitable people when it comes to works. Because for them, works has nothing to do with the household of God, the economy of God, or the doctrine of Christ. Are they saved? I would say 90% of them are. But they build with wood, hay, and stubble by choice. You know, and I'm not talking about your average Christian who's just a victim in the institutional church system and doesn't know any better. I'm talking about people who have become trolls for anything but Christ. They've been given a megaphone with their social media platforms or somebody else's platform. And they're there to advocate something other than Christ. I was just on my at Microsoft Edge. I had the thing open, and the top story that flashed on my screen was a new Moses. How the Christian right is deceived by Trump. Again, I'm not talking about politics here, but even the secular world, ever since the Trump stuff, and who knows if I might even end up voting for him. I don't know what things are going to look like. But that, so what I'm not saying is, I'm not talking about your politics, but it's the mix of politics and religion that's masquerading itself somehow as Christianity that has carried people off into things where they will not hear the doctrine of Christ. And they are here to be proponents of their whatever it is. Are they saved? If they believe the gospel, they're saved. Even if sometimes they doubt their salvation, they're still saved. That's not the question. But they're vessels of dishonor because they are not dealing with incorruptible things. They are carnal. They don't understand spiritual things, and they reject. They will not even tolerate sound doctrine. And now, for me, that's not my business. It's not my business to try to win those people or be nice to them. It is my job to have a platform. You know, I've got a platform here with a comment wall, right? It's my job to make sure that they don't have my platform become their platform for their garbage. So I block them and delete them. And I definitely let you know what I think about all the different doctrines. Some people say, well, he's not walking in love because they're brothers and sisters, and he's not, Well, we're to separate from the vessels of dishonor and pursue with those who call upon the name of the Lord from out of a pure heart. And if we separate ourselves from these, we can be vessels of honor, useful to the master. So, Paul does advocate to Timothy. On the one hand, he's going into the church life, into the church situation as a soldier and a farmer. While on the other hand, he's to separate himself from the element that is bringing anything other than Christ. So there will always be separation until we go home. And that does not mean, we talk about God is harvesting. God will do harvests. But that doesn't mean some people are saved and some people are not saved. And we'll all find out that those people aren't saved. No, the ones that aren't saved, you're going to know it by the time we get out of here. Because they're going to completely renounce the gospel more and more. But there is another harvest, kind of the vessels of dishonor and the vessels of honor, as God is in the 11th hour gathering unemployed idle workers who've been set aside and just standing there for 11 hours because no one hired them. Now he wants to use them. And for that, they need to be vessels of honor. To be useful is to be a vessel of honor in the Father's house. And for that, there has to be separation. So if he's going to have a group of people that are actually useful in the end, all the way to the end, providing meat in season as a steward in the house, there has to be separation. And that's what it's about. Separation is about, how are you effective in ministry if you're entertaining error? Error and leaven eventually leavens the whole lump. You have to be vigilant. The only thing, we don't have a whole bunch of rules that we live by in the Christian life. We have Christ. What we're to do is guard what we've received and not be moved away from it. And that's all the way through all the epistles. That's the apostles' admonition and warning. What are they warning about? It's about false teachings and things that would carry you off as spoil, away from the gospel. So even Paul says, God's able to present you without spot in the body of his flesh through death if you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, not being moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and bears fruit and is growing as all in the world and in you since the day you heard and knew the grace of Christ in truth. I kind of combined a few verses there, but that's all in Colossians 1. And he's not saying you're not going to make it to the end. You might stop believing. No, he's saying don't be moved away from the hope of the gospel as you've heard it, which is according to the dispensation of the grace of God that was given to me to complete the word of God, even the mystery which was hidden from ages and generations, but is now being revealed to the saints, to whom God willed to make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And we announce him, he says, whom we announce, teaching every man and warning every man, admonishing in all wisdom, that we may present every man full grown in Christ. And then he goes on to talk about how he labors, in chapter 2, Colossians, for those that their hearts may be knit together unto all the riches of the full assurance of understanding, they've been comforted in love, but unto all the riches of the full assurance of understanding that come from the acknowledgement of the mystery of God, which is Christ. And there's this idea of a group of people being built up in the knowledge of Christ, comforted in that knowledge, knit together in it, unto full assurance. Paul talks about full assurance of faith as a pursuit of a group of people in a fellowship who have the same teaching, which is Paul's gospel, the revelation of the mystery. Not just how did you get saved, but Christ is your righteousness, your sanctification, your life, your wisdom, your everything. How does he become everything? Well, it's through a very detailed, specific knowledge, but not without fellowship. It's not for an individual, it's for a group of people. That Christ may make it his home in your hearts through faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love, may be apprehend with all the saints. What is the length and breadth and height and depth, to know the love of Christ that passes knowledge, that you may be filled unto the fullness of God. Now that was written into Ephesians, right? Ephesians 3. Well, Paul told Timothy at Ephesus that he needed to separate from vessels of dishonor in the house. So is Christ going to make his home in the hearts of everyone in that house? If there's vessels of dishonor and you're supposed to separate yourself from them, how can you enjoy the love of Christ with them if you're separating from them? Well, there is a difference. Paul said in Philippians that he prayed that their love would abound yet more and more in all wisdom and discernment, that they may be able to approve by testing the things which differ and are more excellent, so that they may be sincere and without offense in the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ to the glory of God. There's this idea of a pursuit. Ephesians 5 says that Christ is, he gave himself for the church that he may sanctify her through the washing of the water of the word, to present her to himself, a glorious church without spot or wrinkle, right? And ultimately, that is when we're transfigured. But it's through the washing of the water of the word. It's through the knowledge of him. And Peter talks about the knowledge of him being, through that knowledge, he ministers an abundant entrance into the kingdom. And he talks about being barren and unfruitful in the knowledge of Jesus Christ versus pursuing the knowledge of Christ, growing in the knowledge of Christ until that knowledge in itself becomes the Lord's way of ministering to you an abundant entrance into the kingdom. It's not whether you're going, it's how you get there. Are you going to be full of joy at the Lord's coming, or are you going to be offended? You know, in Philippians it says that your love may abound yet more and more with all wisdom and discernment, that you may approve by testing the things which differ and are more excellent, that you may be sincere or pure or without spot and without offense in the day of Christ. You can be in the day of Christ and be saved and be thoroughly offended when he shows up. He might catch you in your offense. Why would you be offended? Well, it's because you are not satisfied that Christ is everything. Offense comes because you are invested in something that's not Christ. Why would Christians be invested in things that are not Christ? Well, lack of knowledge. They don't really know what they received. And you could say, well, they're just lukewarm and worldly. Those aren't the offended ones. The ones that are just kind of lukewarm, what most Christians would consider lukewarm, are people who got saved but never could figure out how that related to the Christian life, because every time they went to the institutional church, they were beaten and told to get to work. And they go, this doesn't make sense. I guess I'm just going back to the world. And they're the kind of people who, when wolf evangelists show up on the streets and preach to them, they'll break down in tears because they feel so bad that they're not serving Christ the way they should, and the wolf beats them even more, and then they break down in tears and they put it on a video and say, see, look what I did when she heard the gospel. I got her saved because she's going to work for the Lord now. You know, no, those are like the lepers and the prostitutes of Jesus' time. That, yeah, their lifestyle was full of sin, but it's because they had no strength and they didn't know how to proceed. They weren't even allowed in the temple. You know, those are the kind of people that most people think, well, that's just lukewarm. They're Christian in name only. They're not like me. I go to church all the time. No, you're the one that's offended. Those people are not offended. They're lost. The lost sheep. And they have a high priest. But you're offended. You know, the offended people are the ones who, they're saved in many cases, but are angry at our teaching on reward or sanctification. Because to them, the Christian life starts with a rejection of the gospel once you've believed it. You know, that's just for the lost. That's to get you saved. That's what we go bark at people. We go door knocking and we tell them they had to get saved. But once we're saved, now we get to work. And so it's grace for the entrance of the Christian life and works for the maintenance of the Christian life. All the way to the end. And they think it's the zealous workers that are offended. It's the vessels that actually think they're doing something. And you'll see in Ephesus, the people that Paul is talking about when he talks about separating yourself from vessels of dishonor were the active, zealous ones with the megaphone who presented themselves as representatives of God but taught anything but the doctrine of Christ. Those are the people he was to separate from so that he could be a vessel of honor to minister to people to bruised reeds, who the zealots probably called lukewarm, but the zealots are the lukewarm ones because they try to mix hot and cold. They try to mix law and grace. There are people who want to contact me and talk and talk and talk, but they listen to everybody, okay? They don't listen to me. If they did, they wouldn't listen to these other people. But they listen to wolves like Gene Kim and, the Grace GES people and people that teach you there's a whipping post at the Bema seat. And they want to be brothers and sisters walking in love with me. But I don't have time for that. They are mixed. Then they've chosen that course. And until they separate, see, there is a principle of separation, then I'm not going to spend a lot of time responding to their emails and comments when they seem to have genuine questions, but all they want to do is argue more that it's grace to start the Christian life and works to finish it. And they're going to be offended. But, this is the time, if you really believe, there's a lot of people going around believing that the rapture is right around the corner because they listen to channels that tell them that that's the case. Not because they've studied the prophetic word themselves. That's what's sad. They have no idea what Daniel 9:24 through 27 says or what its significance is and what it means that Luke 21 and Matthew 24 were built around it and all that. They have never studied that. You do a message on it and they're not there. They're not listening to what they consider dry academic messages. To them, rapture is tied in with the whole world is going to hell in a handbasket. I just watched a video about transvestite vampires. Trump's going to clean house. And Jesus better come back soon. They said he's coming next Tuesday. Or whatever. That's the sensationalism, right? With no doctrine of Christ. That's not a rapture watcher. In the sense of, Colleen B. Still Know has been doing some messages on watching on her wall, on her community posts. The real watching is watch the church, watch the condition, watch as people reject. There's a mystery of lawlessness working that's going to lead to a final apostasy, which will culminate in the revelation of the man of sin. That can't happen because there's a restrainer in place. He can't be revealed yet. But watch as people depart from the faith left and right. And it accelerates. And get offended. Not because of you, and they don't like you, but because you touched their sacred cow. They've got something that they're willing to fight for that's not Christ himself, and they won't drop it. These are people that have been carried off as spoil. Are they saved? Yeah, probably 80% of the time they are. But as teachers, we're to have nothing to do with them. We're not to give them a platform, and we're not to let them drain our energy. There's a difference between somebody who's just asking questions because they're growing in the knowledge of the truth and people who are engaging you so that they can try to carry you off into whatever doctrinal system that they've got themselves fascinated with, or whatever political thing, or whatever speculative theory that they're propagating that's not Christ. So 1 and 2 Timothy is all about how God had Paul put Timothy in Ephesus to charge certain people that they would not teach other things than God's economy, which is in faith. There was only one thing that is authorized to be taught. See, we are kind of under the impression that anything that's Christian goes. And it turns out that there were all these different fields that we used to think were, Bible-y and Christian, and Christians in name espoused all these different things, whether it be flat earth or Nephilim theories or rapture speculation or political stuff. And it turned out that the more we learned about Christ is my sanctification, Christ is my life, Christ is my wisdom, and he's the only way I know how to go on, and I can't have anything else other than him, that doctrine really shined light on the difference between God's economy, which is in faith, and any other thing. and showed the damage. And we found out that all those people that we thought had legitimate Christian ministries, which never focused on Christ himself, but always had like other kinds of emphasis, they're all thoroughly Galatianized. Every single one of them. There's no way to be thoroughly grace without actually being thoroughly grace, which means that's the only thing I'm interested in. You know, you want to say Christ is my righteousness, sanctification, and reward. That doctrine, to really understand what it means and all of its implications, he would really have to be your life and your wisdom too. He has to be everything. And that, you know, I'm teaching things, there's people teaching things, but like I said in that Genesis intro, first message, the way the word is designed, God designed it so that you can't learn it without encountering him to really learn it. You can learn things from the Bible. That's not the same thing as learning Christ. And you can't learn Christ without dealing with him individually. And he's here to separate. He is, from the beginning in Genesis, separating light from darkness, the heavens and the earth, water from dry land, and then people. He separates and separates and separates. You know, Noah was separated from that world. Abraham was separated from, well, he separated the people through language at Nimrod, at Babel, by taking the sons of Shem and distinguishing them from everybody else because they knew the blessed language of the covenant of promise. And then we get to Abraham, who's called out. And then, you know, Pharaoh, he's separated. I'm sorry, not Pharaoh, Moses, he's separated with the whole people. It's always separation. And there's still separation going on in the church. And I think that you will see a group of people, they don't want anything but Christ. And you're going to find that if you want to talk about something else, now I'm not, okay, let me distinguish this too. When I say you don't want to talk about anything but Christ, I don't mean that you are totally impatient with everybody who's not high-minded and doesn't understand, and you only want to talk about spiritual things, and you can't interact with anybody in the world. And you're totally unrelatable because you're so friggin' spiritual, and you think you're so spiritual, that you've separated yourself from everybody, and yet nobody can relate to you, and you have no comforts to give. I used to be like that. You know, this language that we speak of Paul, there's people who can handle it and have no humanity. The Catholics, actually, when you read their encyclicals, you go, wow, that's as profound as Paul. It's got all his language in it. But they don't mean the same thing Paul means. And we're going to talk about that too, but when it comes to what is a minister, Paul gives us the type of himself in Corinthians, where he says, look, we're totally transparent. And he said to the church at Galatia, you know, you've received me as an angel and didn't despise the temptation in my flesh. I don't know what that means. He said, you received me in weakness. I came to you in weakness when I preached the gospel to you, and you received me that way and didn't despise my weakness or my temptation that was in my flesh, but treated me like an angel of God. Where was that sense of blessing that you had now that you're associated with these people that seem so spiritual, but they've carried you off from Christ? And he does that in 2 Corinthians 2 and 1 Corinthians, where he says, look, these people boast about how spiritual they are and how occupied with God and Christ they are. But we don't present ourselves that way. We commend ourselves to your conscience in the sight of God, and we are real, totally transparent. You want to talk about boasting? Well, I'll tell you about how ridiculous my situation is and all the things that befell me. And I think God's made us apostles like a circus to men and angels, a spectacle in the world. You know, we're just, and when we're among you, we're gentle as a nursing mother. You know, They did not boast about their own spirituality and demand that everybody come to their level in conversation. There is a place for teaching, but when we talk about ourselves, we should be totally human. And we should be able to relate to human people and human problems. And understand, if you really know grace, it's because you've learned it through comforts that you've received in your own messed up life. Which is full of complexity and is not black and white and forces you into situations where sometimes you have to choose between the lesser of two evils, just to survive the situation and get on. And you're willing to admit that and to reconcile the fact that you're in an earthen vessel in a fallen world and you're living in a toxic stew with the grace of Christ, so that you're not always looking at yourself thinking, well, am I a hypocrite because I told all these people I'm spiritual and look what I just did. How do you reconcile the fact that you're a sinner entrusted with a ministry? Paul said, because we've received mercy, we have this ministry. And then we renounce the hidden things of deceitfulness. The hidden things are all the hidden motives that drive ministry, like ambition, and a desire for people to think you're spiritual or whatever. And that's usually what eventually drives people off into the weeds, away from God's economy and the truth. But that's something, sometimes it gets really hard to detect who's of the truth and who's not. Well, one thing is, are they human? If there's no humanity, and yet they have all the language right, something's wrong. And humanity doesn't put a human in grace doesn't put demands on people. It's there to lift demands off of people. Anyway, because in Paul's day, there were a lot of people who could even speak his language, and yet it was all still not grace. And there was no transparency and there was no humanity in it. And I'm not sure everybody would understand what I'm talking about, but I just know, that when I talk about human stuff, I have to be very human. How do we reconcile the fact that we're sinners with the fact that we're Christians? If you haven't figured that out, you're not ready to be a minister. Paul said, if we seeking to be justified by Christ are found to be sinners, does that make Christ a minister of sin? No. I'm not saying let us do evil that grace may come or anything like that, but what I'm saying is, do you know how to really stand in justification? And none of us really do. Paul said he hadn't obtained it yet. To be found in Christ, not having my own righteousness which is out of the law, but that which is out of God and based on faith. He said, I have not obtained that or been perfected, but one thing I do, forgetting the things which are behind. I'm stretching forward. And he said, as many as are mature will have this mind. And if you're thinking it is in any other way, God will reveal that to you. He did not say, I know how to stand in the righteousness of Christ. See, this is where Paul said in Philippians, which is the peak of his ministry, as far as his maturity. He's like, I am not, there's not every situation that I know that I would always rely on Christ as my righteousness and never, There's a lot of people who say, I would never, they trust themselves too much. And they think that they have obtained some level of spirituality, and it's not been tested. When I first did my channel, I did some kind of message about your mystical hermit spirituality, when tested, doesn't work. And I was talking about people who, they've never been married. They've never lived with somebody enough to know that what they are is a problem for other people. They don't see that at all. They've kept themselves untouched, and they think they're really spiritual because they've never been tested by relationships, and nobody's ever gotten close enough to see this through the sham. If you're married, your family knows what you are. There's no pretending. When I was on my vacation, I was failing miserably every minute of every day. And sometimes I was thinking, why, I am a teacher, blah, blah, blah. I have a ministry, blah, blah, blah. You wouldn't know it from how easily annoyed I am by the fact that we've been out since 9 this morning. It's almost 10 o'clock at night and we haven't stopped. And there's 9 more days of this trip. And I'm exhausted and fed up. And I thought, the way to know whether or not you are really, how spiritual you are, stick you on vacation with somebody's family. I used to think I was so spiritual when I first got saved because I read the Bible 4 or 5 hours a day. I used to work this job where in the morning I worked a 9 to 6 shift. I would read the Bible all the way down till I got there, and I got there at about 7. I rode a bus. Got there around 7, and I had 2 hours. I read the Bible the whole time. Then I'd go to work, and I had, in between calls, I worked at a help desk. I had Bible apps all over my screen, And then at lunch, I went and found a secret hiding place, some conference room, read the Bible and prayed. And then by the time I got home, I'd read another hour. That's 3-4 hours a day. That is not realistic for most people. Then, as I started getting jobs that had more responsibility, I found that I could not invest. Now, that was a situation where God's grace was there for me. But I thought it was my spirituality. Look how spiritual I am. Nobody, and that was the time when my wife would take me to a craft fair and I would have anxiety attacks because, first of all, everybody's in the flesh and now I'm in the world. All these people doing crafts are in the flesh. But I would go home and I would just get an anxiety attack and say, we have to go home. We have to leave now. I'd make her leave. Usually made her cry. Ruined her day. She could not be happy because eventually Dave's going to have an anxiety attack and we're going to have to race home so we can read his Bible. Seriously. That was the first 10 years of my Christian life. Maybe 6. But then I started getting more responsibilities and stuff. And I eventually ended up in a situation where I couldn't read the Bible more than once a week. And I felt so low and felt so condemned. And I used to condemn every Christian who couldn't read the Bible as much as I did. How are they ever going to grow like me? The question is, can you function in this life and be a real human being knowing that you're a sinner and actually standing on justification and not looking at your spiritual practices to determine your concept of how spiritual you are? I couldn't. I was under condemnation for years because of how unspiritual I was. Because it wasn't like in the beginning, Why? Because I really didn't understand justification. Did that mean I wasn't saved? No. Often I feared losing my salvation, but I was sealed with the Spirit, No, the question is, for ministry, you got to be a kind of person who knows how to comfort people with the comforts that you receive from God. And that means you have to actually experience things where you learn what your flesh is and you know what it is. And you're not going to boast beyond your capabilities and think you're super spiritual just because you can be eloquent. That doesn't comfort anybody. All that does is make people go, man, I wish I was like that guy. I don't talk now like I ever did. And I can tell you about the Bible, but when I talk about myself, I'm not presenting anything other than, look, man, the only way this works is if you know God's grace. And that does not mean you've reached a place of spiritual anything. Actually, it's the opposite. The way up is down. You know what your flesh is, and you really don't expect anything good from it anymore. And you're not going to ever fall into the trap of agreeing with someone who's putting expectations on the flesh, because you know what it is. So that when you talk to people, and they come to you with ridiculous situations, you're not appalled and then try to be Mr. Spiritual to talk to them. You know, there's a lot of people who have situations that I don't know how to touch or advise, and so I don't. It's called knowing your limits, and yet resting in Christ and not being disappointed that you hit your limits. Sorry, this isn't where I was going to go, but I was talking about what is the qualification of a minister. How do we know the false from the true? On the one hand, there is a language and there is the truth. But, again, if you really are someone that sees Christ as your righteousness, sanctification, and reward, and really understand the implications, it's because you've actually experienced Him as your wisdom in the midst of all kinds of failure. And you know you can't go back and build up some other kind of righteousness or some other kind of sanctification. You've already tried that. You already know. And so you're done with pretense. It never got you what you wanted anyway. Everybody could see through it anyway, anybody who was close to you. The hermits, the reason, like in the early church, people became hermits so that they wouldn't have to talk to the world, was so that no one would interrupt their own perceived state of super sanctification. You know, there's the life of Brian. The crowd's chasing after Brian, and I think he trips over a guy who's living in a ditch. And the guy goes, ow! And then the guy's furious because he just broke an 18-year vow of silence that he had taken. And Brian messed it up because he exclaimed, ow! You know. That's what spiritual hermits are like. They blame everybody else when they're in the flesh. You know, you got me in the flesh. No, you're already in the flesh. Your so-called spirituality is the flesh. How do I know? Because it can't survive a single test. You don't think you're justified anymore the minute somebody gets on your nerves. So the way you protect yourself is to hide from everybody and only do spiritual things, not interact with anybody, so that you won't get in the flesh. Because whenever you think you're in the flesh, you forget you're saved. You know, that's not someone who knows how to be a minister yet. They're still trying to figure out what is justification and how do I stand in it, even when I am in the flesh and I know it. I'm out of control. And again, marriage tests that, vacations test that, work, stress. God is not interested in you proving how spiritual you are to Him. He's wanting to prove to you that the flesh can't do anything. And there's a long journey to get there. And it's marked by embarrassment and failure, and finally reconsidering your expectations and in fact dropping them all. I went through 7 years before my YouTube channel with no church, just feeling like a failure. No one to talk to about spiritual things. You know, no witness to speak of, so to speak. No thought that I'd ever bless anyone. I thought I was done. And why 7 years? Or, I mean, was it 7 years? It would be interesting if it is 7 years, but it took that long to dry me out. I was detoxing from all the religious dopamine hits I'd given myself over all the years of my zealous pursuit of seeking to be the most righteous, holy person in the world. I wanted to be one of the two witnesses or one of the 144,000, whichever's got a spot available for me, I'll take it. And you think I'm kidding. You know, that's another thing, is that when we judge all these things, we're judging ourselves first. We judge teachings, we judge what we went through first. Everything that I know how to speak to you about that's erroneous, almost all of it, is something I've embraced at some level for years. And I know the fruit of it. When I talk about Christ is our reward, I know what the wage system is. And it's not because those people over there believe that. It's because I did. I thought I was going to outer darkness, that the kingdom was a reward for the overcomers, and I had not overcome, and I had no chance to. And I had the doctrine that informed it, like I could not unsee it. I could not unsee it. And in fact, it wasn't until I got out of that Chinese group that, and I finally got on YouTube, I found Dennis Rucker, I think, up at Duluth Bible in Minnesota. I don't know much about that ministry, but he did a message about why he was not GES. And he talked about outer darkness. And I thought, wow, there's another group that teaches that. Then I found out that Chuck Missler had embraced it. But I didn't know, because I'd been in this little Chinese group for 10 years. I had no idea what the landscape was like out there. But, most of the people who are espousing that James is just talking about being profitable before men, and a lot of the arguments we hear about James, justification before men, come from the GES in this community. And those people teach that the kingdom is a reward for overcoming, and that the flip side is beatings, punishments, and loss, and shame, and darkness. That's the portion of believers, even wrath. Well, I know how damaging that is, because I endured that kind of teaching in a stricter way for 10 years before I came. So a minister is qualified by his own experience of failure. Paul knew how to speak about law, righteousness, and seeking to be justified by works because of what he was as a Pharisee. He could point to it. He never pointed to himself and said, look how spiritual I am, and look what I've gained, and look what... No. Whenever he talked about himself, it was all, I'm the biggest sinner, I'm the biggest, I'm sure he was approachable, although I think that if I was Mark, like living at the time when he and Barnabas got the fight because he didn't want to bring Mark, I would have been Mark. I don't think I could endure Paul's missionary journeys. No way. Guy was hardcore. But as far as approachability, I don't think he thought he was super spiritual and needed to maintain a separation from sinners or people with real problems, lest they find out what he was too. He wasn't trying to hide what he was. You received me in weakness, and my temptation in my flesh wasn't despised by you, but you received me as an angel. He was able to just be completely transparent while preaching the gospel. So there's a qualification for a minister that we've received mercy. And yeah, we do talk about separating from those dishonorable vessels, but that's not talking about people who watch TV, or wear pants. There's a certain seminary that doesn't allow women to wear pants. Well, what are they wearing? Is it some kind of nudie camp? Anyway, the ordinances is not what we're talking about when we talk about separating. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. No, it is separating from people that have an agenda to take you away from Christ with doctrine that does not present him and the gospel as everything. They think the gospel is irrelevant now. Now that they're Christians, you're to get to work, and there's even another kind of justification. And if you have sympathies to that kind of teaching, and you want to talk to me about that, I'm not going to give you the time of day. If somebody comes to me and asks me genuine questions about how do I live this Christian life, even though we're sinners, or some doctrinal things related to Christ, and Christ is the answer, I can do that. But if you're getting on my wall to talk about Nephilim, you're blocked, or the comment is deleted. If you're getting on my wall to talk and you want to get into an argument about, so that you can push a view that, there's another kind of justification by works. No. Does that mean I don't think you're a brother? No. It means that I'm separate. I'm not going to let you have a platform on my channel. And if you email me, I'm not going to respond. If I know you're sympathizing with these kind of teachings, I don't want anything to do with you. The people who think that they're righteous and really doing some work around here and want to sanctimoniously wag their finger at everybody else and say, you should get to work too, they're not doing any work anyway. But they're evil. They become evil workers. They're vessels of dishonor. Are they saved? Yeah. I know some that are absolutely saved. I want nothing to do with them. So when I talk about separation, we're not talking about just separating yourself from people who have weakness, and all that. We're talking about, in Timothy, it's talking about separating yourself from people who've become vessels of dishonor because they dishonor themselves because they've moved away from God's economy. And so we'll have to talk about what is God's economy when we come to 1 Timothy 1:4. But I think the next message will be from Ephesus. Paul, the elders in Ephesus, in Acts, while he's on his way to Jerusalem, and how he warned them for not day and night for 3 years with tears nonstop about wolves that were coming and would even rise from among them, because that sets the stage for us to understand that Ephesus got attacked. The churches in Asia especially got attacked. That's why we see them in the book of Revelation. All those letters to the churches in Asia were all ones that had departed from Paul's ministry because of vessels' dishonor. Okay, so I guess we're going to go into 1 Timothy to talk about, what were all the different kinds of teachings that led people astray, and what is the remedy, antidote, which is the doctrine of Christ. And I'm not sure when I'm going to get into it. It's been really hard for me to do messages like this because everybody's home. And I have freedom to speak right now because no one's home. But the minute somebody comes in the house, I can't just boldly be speaking. And for some reason, in the past, it always worked out where I could go on walks or whatever. This summer, it's just not, I'm busier than normal with writing and stuff like that. So my windows to teach like this are much more limited. But when everybody goes back to school, I'll have my days open again. Maybe that'll change some things. But I trust the Lord that His timing is perfect and He'll give me the utterance when it's time to visit this. All right, take care.